From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. On today's program, we'll be talking about the recently completed Defense Department Global Posture Review, or GPR. The result of a 9-month-long process, the GPR is designed to help the U.S. military decide where its forces should be positioned over the next several years and the relevant troop numbers. Joining us today is Bilal Saab, Senior Fellow at MEI and the founding director of the Defense and Security Program. He previously worked in the Pentagon as a senior advisor for security cooperation with oversight responsibilities for U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM. He's also the author of the upcoming book, Rebuilding Arab Defense, U.S. Security Cooperation in the Middle East, set to be released in April 2022. Bilal, it's great to have you on the program. Welcome back.
Nice to be with you, Alistair, and thank you for doing this and everything else you are doing at MEI.
Of course. To start off, for our listeners who might not follow all things defense and security quite as closely as you do, can you briefly explain what the Global Posture Review does and why it matters?
Sure, but before we start, Alistair, I want to give a shout out to a friend who I believe is doing tremendous work on defense and especially on the GPR, and that's Becca Wasser with the Center for New American Security. I tried to bring Becca on this podcast, I think sort of a last minute, that's my fault, but unfortunately she's tied up this morning. I think it's important to recognize the good work of colleagues, and I think Becca deserves all the credit. So, okay, to your question, what does the GPR do? And why does it matter? I think the first part of the question is easy. Second part, not so much, because it depends on really who you ask. Of course, since you asked me, I'll give you my opinion. So as the name suggests, the GPR is a review of where and how the United States should station its troops and military assets overseas. We are a global power, as you know, and which means we have global interests and a physical presence in many parts of the world. So some kind of organized, ideally strategic approach to our posture worldwide is not just desirable, but necessary, in my opinion. This isn't like, placing little green men on the chessboard. That it's got to be guided by some kind of a strategy. And we have to do this every few years, simply because the world keeps changing. So new threats, new opportunities pop up, which requires us to continuously adjust our posture to reflect those changes. But I do want to emphasize that those changes are typically modest and they happen gradually, not suddenly. And this GPR, frankly, is no exception. Why does the GPR matter? I can tell you, if you ask 10 defense professionals or analysts and ask them that question, half of them will say it does matter and the other half will say, no, it doesn't. So let me tell you what I think. I think this exercise is important because at least it pushes us as a department, even though I'm outside the department now, to think more carefully about our alliances and partnerships around the world and then try to prioritize them in accordance with our national defense strategy.
Following up on that, what exactly does the process of putting the GPR together entail, and how much input do our partners have?
Oh, well, none of this is possible without the consent of these allies and partners. I mean, like I said, this is not just like us doing this in the Pentagon individually without the permission to station our men and women on the soil of these partners, to use their ports, to fly in their skies, to gain access to bases and other military structures. Let's be very clear. There is no forward deployed U.S. presence worldwide without the consent of those partners. And this whole GPR, frankly, would be a fantasy without their cooperation.
While the GPR itself is classified, the broad brushstrokes have been made public. What are the likely findings of this new review, and how do they affect the Middle East in particular?
Yeah, good question. So whatever the Pentagon released just a couple of days ago as far as press statement is obviously not a reflection of everything they've worked on in this document. I mean, that's why there's always a version that's, as you said yourself, Alison, that's available to the public and one that's classified. But generally speaking, the GPR suggests that there will be a stronger military presence in the Indo-Pacific to support Washington's strategic competition with China. regardless of how we feel about that. But that's what it's going to suggest, and it has suggested. And of course, because resources are finite, that means that those additional resources that are being shipped to East Asia are going to have to come from somewhere. And that somewhere includes the Middle East. But as I said before, the GPR will not enact a massive shift of US military assets from the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific. It will inevitably entail greater movement, but I think it's still going to be modest, of American forces away from the Middle East. And you can imagine how that's going to freak out a bunch of regional partners in the Middle East because they are so focused on the number of troops that we have and the number of assets that we have on their territory, because this is the closest thing they will get to a more formal security commitment to them in the absence of a defense treaty or a defense pact with any of those countries.
Taking a step back, what do you like and dislike about the new GPR?
Oh, I love this. Okay, well, let's start with what I like. I do like that the GPR is at least informed by the interim national security strategy of the Biden administration. And that's confirmed to us by my good personal friend, Mara Karlin, the current Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Capabilities, who, if you recall, Alistair, was on our show, the Defense Leadership Series, not too long ago. So there is some strategic logic and guidance behind the GPR. And the GPR also appreciates the new environment of strategic competition with China. But frankly, that's the limit of what I like about it. And what I dislike is a lot more. But before I get into that, I want to offer some caveats that I think are important. And my biggest caveat is that I'm not in the building anymore. And I'm just not privy to the difficult trade-offs that had to be made and the intense coordination that must have taken place among all the stakeholders, whether it's the geographic combatant commands, the civilian bureaucracy in the Pentagon. I just don't have a good understanding of, how the whole process played out, obviously. And oftentimes with these strategic documents, you go in with the best intentions and the loftiest, ambitions. But once you get your hands dirty and try to address the concerns of everybody, you end up with a product that's underwhelming, to say the least, especially with the GPR, because it is by nature a long-term document that's subject to so many variables, some of which, like I said before, are beyond our control because the partners and the allies have a say in this. Now, having said all this, I hate the fact that we're releasing the GPR before an NDS, so the National Defense Strategy. Yes, the GPR is informed by the interim national security strategy, but I would have much preferred to see it directly flow from an NDS. The Biden administration promised us that they would bring back process to the machinery of foreign policy and interagency coordination. And I'm sure they've done a lot of that. And it's been hard because if you remember, Elsa, what they inherited from the previous administration is an absolute mess. I mean, it was foreign policy by tweet, right? But boy, did the Biden team botch this GPR process because we could have at least pretended and messaged to the world that our global posture is a direct result of our global defense strategy or national defense strategy. So to me, this is just bad optics. And both our allies and adversaries, more importantly, are scratching their heads. Now, most likely the GPR will be a reflection of the NDS ultimately, and the two are going to be aligned. But just don't tell me that you bring in back process and then you unveil a GPR before an NDS. At the end of the day, and this is where I'm a little bit less harsh, none of this might matter practically, because what matters most is not what we say in a document, but what we do. And to understand strategy or infer at least what our strategy is, you just got to follow the money, especially in the Pentagon. And you got to read the budget, because budgets can kill even the best strategies. And this is an old problem, obviously, whether it's the budget that informs the strategy or the strategy that informs the budget. But ultimately, what we do, our actions around the world, are going to be a better reflection of our posture than the other way around. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay.
You touched on it briefly earlier, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of elaborate in a little bit more detail. How do you think U.S. partners in the region will react to the new GPR, both kind of immediately and in the longer term?
Right. So, assuming those who are more familiar with this process, or at least understand that we're actually going through this process, are going to read this document, they won't like it. They won't like it because it will confirm to them that the United States is leaving the region, which of course we're not. I think General McKenzie, the CENTCOM commander, won this round. I think he will retain most, if not all of his forces and resources, despite everything that's been said about a drastic shift away from the Middle East, which personally I'm not buying. Those regional partners simply do not want us to further reduce our military footprint in the region because they believe this will weaken deterrence and it will embolden the Iranians. We, on the other hand, believe that we have been relatively overinvested militarily in the Middle East, and we must free up some of our forces, like I said, to be able to better deter China's rapidly growing military power in the Indo-Pacific. So on the surface, it sounds like an unsolvable dilemma, but frankly, in reality, it isn't. And this is something I wrote about in 2015 with Barry Pavel, my old colleague at the Atlantic Council, who has had his fair share of doing GPRs during the Obama administration. So he has a lot of experience in this. He and I argued that the conversation about the future of U.S. military posture, not just in the Middle East, but around the world, should never start with numbers of American troops, aircraft carriers, fighter jets, missile defense batteries. I mean, all those things are important, but the more important stuff, the emphasis should always be on what we do with those things, our military effectiveness, and how we could best achieve our stated objectives in the NDS. So in other words, as I've said now probably 5 times, posture planning should be strategy-driven and capabilities-based. It's not the result of some random moves that look good in isolation. And for the purposes of U.S. posture in the Middle East, I think the most effective and efficient way to counter terrorists, deter Iran, and then, God forbid, fight Iran if deterrence fails, is by constructing an integrated posture with the regional partners, most crucially in the missile defense and maritime domains. I think those U.S. forces that we have in the region should be postured to contribute to the self-defense of these regional partners, but not assume that responsibility entirely like we did in the past, and to some extent, well, I would say to a large extent, in Operation Desert Storm, if you recall, in 1990 and 1991.
Taking a step back to look at the big picture here, what do you think all of this is likely to mean for the U.S. and the Middle East going forward?
Well, I think I hinted at it in terms of posture. I think not a whole lot is going to change. And if it is going to change, it's going to take months, if not years, to really see those changes taking place. We still have almost the same presence, and I don't expect a massive shift of resources away from the region. I mean, you got to remember what our objectives are in the region and whether that posture is suitable to achieve those objectives. You know, goal number 1 is to deter Iran from A, building a nuclear weapon, and B, assaulting our regional partners, at least conventionally, right? And we've struggled with the second part, given what happened in Abqaiq against those oil facilities of the Saudis in the fall of 2019. And add to that the series of provocations and attacks that happened at sea around that time. And as far as the Iranians building a nuclear weapon, we're closer than ever to the Iranians obtaining the bomb, if they so choose to do that. So you got to start asking your question, like, if deterrence fails, and especially now those talks that are happening in Vienna, if they fail, what do we do then? And this is not a posture question. This is a strategy question. And I don't think the Biden administration knows what its plan B is. And meanwhile, of course, the Israelis are watching our every move. And just like our other regional partners, they have a say in this because to them, unlike us, this is an existential matter, right? So we're sort of in a pickle because what we decide to do will have implications for our posture. Right? Whether it's a posture that is purely made for deterrence, that's one thing, or a posture that is made also for not just deterrence, but for actual war fighting. These are 2 drastically different postures. And right now, I feel like we're just focusing on the deterrence element. We don't have an answer to what if deterrence fails. It's not because we don't have the capabilities, we do. And as a matter of fact, we also have the ability to bring in additional resources very quickly. But what we don't have is a decision on whether we're actually going to go to war against Iran if deterrence fails.
We've covered a lot of ground here, but before we wrap up, I just want to give you an opportunity. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, Alistair, I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed because I thought that with this team, many of whom, like I said, I know personally, I respect a tremendous deal. I thought with them, like, coherence and added rationality would return to our foreign policy process, at least defense policy process. But I think they botched this GPR. And my gut tells me that they know it, but nobody's going to admit it, of course, at least publicly.
That's all we have time for today, but thank you very much for joining the program, Bilal.
Thank you, Alistair. I really appreciate it.
That was Bilal Saab, MEI Senior Fellow and the founding director of the Institute's Defense and Security Program. You can follow all of MEI's coverage of the GPR and other defense and security matters on our website at www.mei.edu. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in and to our production team for their work on today's episode. You can follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.